Once there was a woodcutter with 2 children and their stepmother. The boy's name was Hansel, and the girl's name was Gretel. They lived so poorly that sometimes there was not even anything to eat. And then one evening he lay in bed, pondering how to feed the children further. His wife advised him to have children in the forest, light a fire, give a piece of bread each and leave them there, not all 4 of them die of hunger. But the woodcutter did not agree. And until then, his wife persuaded him that he finally agreed. And the children, because of hunger, also could not sleep and heard everything that their stepmother said to their father. And when the parents fell asleep, Hansel secretly rushed out of the house. The moon was shining brightly, and the white stones glittered like coins. Hansel pocketed as many of them as he could fit. Then he returned home and the children went to bed. In the morning, the stepmother came to the children, gave each of them a piece of bread, and they all went to the forest together. On the way, Hansel threw out white stones one by one. When they arrived at the clearing, my father began to light a fire. He ordered the children to sit near the fire and make sure that it didn't go out, while they and their stepmother would go for more firewood. They sat, tired, and fell fast asleep. When the children woke up, it was a dark night all around. And when a full month had risen in the sky, Hansel took his sister by the hand and went, looking for the way through the pebbles, which glittered like new coins, and showed them the way. They walked all night long, and at dawn they came to their father's house. Some time passed. And the children again heard how the stepmother one night began to beg their father to get rid of the children. He refused, but his wife did not want to listen to him. She cursed and expressed all sorts of reproaches to him. When the parents fell asleep, Hansel, like the last time, wanted to collect stones, but the stepmother locked the door and the boy could not leave the house.
Thank you.
Early in the morning, the children were given a piece of bread each, even less than the previous time. On the way to the forest, Hansel shredded his piece in his pocket and threw the crumbs on the ground. The stepmother took them even further into the forest. Again a big fire was lit, and the father ordered the children to watch the fire while they and their stepmother chopped some more wood. When lunchtime came, Gretel shared her piece of bread with Hansel. And they fell asleep. We woke up when the dark night fell. And then a month came up, and they got together on their way, but they could not find a single crumbs, because thousands of birds fluttering in the forest had long been eating those crumbs. So the children walked for a very long time, but they could not get out of the forest. Suddenly, the road led them to the hut. Coming closer, the children saw that the house was all built of bread and biscuits, and the windows were made of pure sugar. Hansel reached up and broke off a piece of the roof, while Gretel went to the window and began gnawing at its windows. And then the door in the hut opened wide, and the old woman came out, leaning on a crutch. Hansel and Gretel were so scared that they even dropped their tidbits from their hands. And the old woman was kind and invited them to her hut. There was already abundant food on the table: milk, cookies, apples, and nuts. After dinner, the old woman made 2 clean beds for the children, and Hansel and her sister thought they were in heaven. But the old woman only pretended to be affectionate, but in fact she was an evil witch, who built her bread hut for this purpose in order to lure children. Early in the morning, while the children were sleeping, she took Hansel and put him in a small cage. And she ordered her sister to do everything that the wicked witch demanded of her. The old woman decided to fatten the boy in order to eat him later. So Gretel began to cook the most delicious food for Hansel, and she herself got nothing but leftovers. Some time passed, and the boy did not get fat. Then the old woman did not want to wait any longer, and decided to cook and eat Hansel. She ordered Gretel to light the stove and apply water. When the stove warmed up, the old woman ordered her to climb into the stove and see if it was hot enough. So she wanted to push the girl into the fire and bake her. But Gretel knew what was on her mind. She said that she did not know how to get in there, and asked the witch to show herself. The old woman got angry and climbed into the oven. Then Gretel pushed her and slammed the shutter behind the witch. Wow, how terribly the old woman howled then. Gretel, meanwhile, rushed to Hansel and opened the cage. Having freed their brother, they went to the witch's room, in which there were boxes of pearls and precious stones in all corners, filled their pockets with them, and went home. For several days the children were looking for their way back. The forest seemed more and more familiar, and at last they saw their father's house in the distance. How glad he was to see his children alive! Hansel and Gretel poured on the floor all the pearls and gems they had taken from the witch. There was no need to think about food. And they began to live, live, and rejoice. And the father drove the evil stepmother out of the house. My grandfather planted a turnip, and it grew big, very big. Never seen such a turnip in the villages. And so my grandfather went to pick a turnip. Pulls, but cannot pull. The grandfather did not know what to do. And that way, but it will not pull out in any way. Then the grandfather called the grandmother to pull the turnip. An old woman came, grabbed her grandfather by the back, and they began to pull the turnip together. The grandmother is for the grandfather, and the grandfather for the turnip. They pull, but they just can't pull it. It's just some kind of trouble. The grandfather pondered and realized that it was time to call the granddaughter for help. And they began to call the little girl at the top of their voices, so much so that the whole village trembled. The granddaughter came running, took hold of the grandmother's skirt, and again they began to pull the turnip. The granddaughter for the grandmother for the grandfather, and the grandfather for the turnip. They pull, but they cannot pull. The old people were upset, because such a turnip disappears. Then the granddaughter decided to call her dog, Bug, so that at least she could help pull the turnip. Bug came running, grabbed her granddaughter by the handkerchief, and they began to pull the turnip together. A bug for a granddaughter for a grandmother for a grandfather, and a grandfather for a turnip. They pull, but they cannot pull again. The grandfather and grandmother were even more upset, because the uneaten turnip will disappear. Suddenly the bug barked and ran away. The dog returned not alone, but with a cat. She grabbed the beetle by the tail, and began to pull the turnip all together. A cat for a bug for a granddaughter for a grandmother for a grandfather, and a grandfather for a turnip. Pull, but not stretch. The old people were upset with their granddaughter. They will not see a turnip. Suddenly the cat ran into the barn. She was gone for a long time, and she returned not alone, but with a mouse. The grandfather and the woman, and the granddaughter and the beetle began to ask the mouse for help. She wagged her tail, squeaked twice, and then grabbed the cat's fur with her little paws. And again they pulled the turnip together. A mouse for a cat for a bug for a granddaughter for a grandmother for a grandfather, and a grandfather for a turnip. Pull, and pulled the turnip. And so the grandfather decided to share the turnip. He took half for himself, gave a third to his grandmother, a little less to his granddaughter, a piece of the beetle, a half of a piece for a cat, and a very small crumb for a mouse. The animals were offended by their grandfather because they helped in the same way, and he divided the turnip dishonestly. A year has passed. Grandfather planted the turnip again, and it grew larger than before. For a long time such a turnip has not been seen in the villages. Cool. And so my grandfather went to pick a turnip. Pulls and this and that, but will not pull. The grandfather did not know what to do. And I decided to call my grandmother for help again. They began to pull the turnip together. The grandmother is for the grandfather, and the grandfather for the turnip. They pull, but they just can't pull it. Then the grandmother called her granddaughter. The granddaughter came running, and they pulled the turnip together. The granddaughter for the grandmother for the grandfather, and the grandfather for the turnip. Pull, but not stretch. The grandfather was upset and went to ask the animals for help. He called Bug, but she only turned her face away, wagged her tail and ran away. Grandfather found a cat, and she climbed onto the roof of the barn. Then the old man went to the mouse, but she did not listen to him either. Then the grandfather realized that the animals were offended by him for not honestly sharing the turnip. After all, without a mouse, a cat or a bug, grandfather cannot see a turnip. The old man thought, collected his thoughts, and went to the animals again. He apologized to the bug, asked the cat for forgiveness and promised the best piece of turnip for the mouse. Then the animals agreed to help their grandfather.
Okay.
And they began to pull the turnip together. A mouse for a cat for a bug for a granddaughter for a grandmother for a grandfather, and a grandfather for a turnip. Pull, and pulled the turnip. Baba baked turnips. For a long time such delicious turnip has not been seen in the villages. And the grandfather divided the turnip equally, a piece for himself, grandmother and granddaughter. A bug with a cat and even a mouse were received each piece. Everyone was happy. So, they lived in peace and harmony happily ever after.